Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out to our first Tea Talk here in Keene. We look forward to doing a lot more programming here in partnership with Keene State and other organizations here in town. We're the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire, and what we're doing is we're working to expand and raise the awareness for New Hampshire's Black history across the state in order to create more inclusive communities. Today's program, actually, New Hampshire Beyond Black and White, is brought to you in part by a grant from the New Hampshire Humanities Council in partnership with Keene and with the Black Heritage Trail. We offer a variety of programs throughout the year, creating these community dialogues, these small community dialogues about history in your own backyard, in order for us to really get past these notions, the things that divide us, issues of race and racism and different cultural issues that keep us apart. So our goal is to create these safe spaces to have these dialogues. So I hope that as we go through today, that you'll be comfortable enough, that you'll be open enough, that you'll get, there's a word that they're using these days, raggedy enough, to really talk so we can have real deep, meaningful conversations. There's an African tradition that says when people get together for a cup of tea, they have 3 cups of tea. One is very strong, and that's in representing your early part of your life where you have all the energy. The second cup gets a little weaker when you're kind of mellow, and the third one is when you're like really comfortable with where you are. So I want us to be really comfortable with where we are, like we're having that 3rd cup of tea, and just be willing and open to get into our dialogue. Just some ground rules for the discussion. Leave them up there. It's just we want to be respectful, listen, share the ear time, focus on the idea, be present, be crisp about what is core. I thought I said score. Be open-minded, honor people's confidentiality. And this allows us to be really open. It's okay to put issues of race and class on the table. That's what we're about. And be raggedy. And without much ado, I'm going to pass it over to our moderator who will introduce our panel and we can get started. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming out this afternoon, this beautiful fall day. It is beautiful. So I'm really happy to be here with 3 wonderful people and the rest of you as well. I think that what better place in New Hampshire to really look at going beyond black and white than in Keene, given the history that we will be exploring a bit around the Johnson family. And if you haven't seen the mural, have you seen the mural from the wall dogs dedicated to Dr. Johnson? Well, it's if you go down it's right off of Main Street, and it's
Lamson Street and Main Street. Right.
So, yeah, and if you ask anyone, they'll tell you I think it's well done. So if you have a chance, go and do that. So I'll let each one of the panelists introduce themselves. What will happen? Dr. Benequist will start off with some kind of footage about the family. And what happened within the Keene area at the time. Dr. Hux is one of our faculty members here, and he'll talk some about race and race relations. And we have Mr. Wayne Miller, who will give us some ideas, because he grew up here in New Hampshire, not far from here. And so he could really give you some insights into race relations here in the great state of New Hampshire. So without much further ado, I'm gonna pass it over, and then we'll leave time for us to have a really good conversation. How about that? Because to have a really bad conversation would be counterproductive. So each panelist will introduce themselves.
Just a brief introduction and pass it on, right?
Yeah, then we'll come back.
I'm Larry Benequist, Professor Emeritus, Keene State College, Film Studies. And my connection to this is a friendship with the Johnston family. And in 1989, we had a 40th anniversary reunion of the film at Keene State, which brought 1,500 people here to see a 40-year-old film, and helped, I think, in some ways, bring it back into the community's consciousness. But most important, a lot of people got to meet the family, who mostly are now deceased.
Hello, I am Darrell Hux. I'm a faculty member here in the Education Department. I'm actually the chair of the Education Department right now. And my work is about preparing teachers, the next generation. And we can't prepare teachers without having them know about and think about their families and the families that they are going to serve. So when Dottie asked me to come and join and be a part of this, I was very excited. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'll share more later.
And my name is Wayne Miller. I am a resident of Heartland, Vermont. I am a person in long-term recovery. I am a certified recovery support worker for New Hampshire. I last year co-founded the Center for Recovery Resources in Claremont, which is a peer recovery-based center. We do recovery coaching, recovery meetings, sober events. And last year I also founded Living Proof Mentoring, which is a program for Black youth in Vermont, New Hampshire, matching them with Black mentors to combat racial and rural isolation.
Thank you very much. So let's go ahead and get started.
So we'll get started now. I know one of the first things that, I moved here about 20 plus years ago, and I didn't know anything about New Hampshire, let alone Keene. And one of the first things that, in my research, I found was this Reader's Digest film from 1957 or so. 1949, and I watched it and I thought, what a cool place. And so it contributed a lot because I wanted to know the history of the city and as it related to African Americans, because I knew I was moving to a place that wasn't known for having African Americans. But since living here and being exposed to the work of Jerry Ann and the Black Heritage Trail, I've learned a lot about African Americans living in New Hampshire, and it's not a new thing. It's just not a new thing. And so it's been very eye-opening to find out some of the things, including about Oma Judd. If you haven't read the book is back there, please read that one. That's a great book to talk about. So we'll get started. So I think Larry will kick us off, and then we'll move our way down.
Should we begin the first few minutes of the documentary?
Okay.
And I'll explain how the documentary came to be made. So in I think I mentioned before, in 1989, on the 40th anniversary of the release of Lost Boundaries, we had a reunion in Keene, and New Hampshire Public Television came to the reunion. At the reunion were the members of the family, the Johnson family came from Hawaii and Miami and all over. The DeRochemont family was a very brave producer of this film, two-time Oscar winner, who produced the film, shot it in Maine and in New Hampshire, using his own money, and played for 6 months, half a year, at the Astor Theater in Midtown Manhattan. That's how popular this film was. Won Cannes Film Festival Award as well. Who's seen the film, Lost Boundaries? Oh, great. You probably have seen the documentary too. But maybe just the first few minutes of it, 9 minutes or so, you get to meet the family and some people in Keene. We want to time 25 minutes long, maybe 10 minutes of it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so I'll just stop talking here. We can start it off, sure.
Hello, I'm Chris Levy, and welcome to a very special edition of the New Hampshire Crossroads. Today we are in the city of Keene, New Hampshire, to celebrate a reunion. A reunion of family, of community, and of a movie. The year was 1949, and the movie was entitled Lost Boundaries. And 40 years ago, it was playing just down the street here at the Scenic Theater. And later on tonight, we are going to present that movie right here on New Hampshire television. Now, perhaps you've never heard of Lost Boundaries, and so that's a shame. For one thing, it was set here in New Hampshire and was photographed, for the most part, on location around the state. But most importantly, of Washington and Beaver Street. Now, Doc and Thyra Johnson were pretty much your average family. They had 4 kids, a nice house, and were pillars of the community. But the Johnsons had a secret, not much of a secret by today's standards. The things were very different in the early part of this century.
You see, when I was a little girl, to be black was almost like a no-no. So when I came along, those who were light would go and take advantage of what white people could because they could get by. And then if you were very dark, well, then you couldn't get by. You couldn't go to the movies unless you had to sit way up in the balcony, and you had to go up to almost like the fire escapes to get to the balcony, and you were really ostracized. You had no advantages if you were dark.
In the America that Dr. and Mrs. Johnston grew up in, the fact that you came from an interracial family meant that you were considered and treated as black. Being black in the era before the Civil Rights Movement and confronting discrimination, segregation, and racism. Albert Johnston and Thyra Bauman met and were married in Chicago, where Dr. Johnston was a student at Rush Medical College. Finding a hospital that would take a black man as an intern proved to be no easy task for the young couple.
He could get his degree in MD until he had a year's internship. And so he applied to these hospitals and they wouldn't take him, and he wanted to go to first-rate hospital. And he did apply to one of the black hospitals, and but they were full, and they didn't really have room for an intern that year. And so he applied for other places, and so he'd come home and he said, I could have gotten that internship if I hadn't told him I was black. So I said, well, try and keep on trying, and I said, this time, don't tell about your race. So the Maine General Hospital said took out to him for an interview, and he decided that he wouldn't say anything. So he didn't, and he didn't ask him.
I don't think he would cut the job. I don't think he would. That's the way it was. When he tried to get a job, when he tried to do his residency at Northern Hospital and took out Negro, they wouldn't have him. When he tried to do his residency in the South, they wouldn't have him because it was white. So he just stopped filling that out altogether, and then it took from Portland, Maine to Gordon, New Hampshire to Keene.
So the Johnsons moved to northern New England, where they lived their life as whites. It was called passing back in those days. Upon completion of his residency at Maine General Hospital, Dr. Johnston set up a practice in Gorham, New Hampshire. Mrs. Johnston began raising a growing family. After 8 years in Gorham, Doc Johnston decided to specialize in radiology. The family eventually settled down in the city of Keene. Relatives and friends, meanwhile, helped the Johnstons keep their secret.
They knew that we were what you call passing. They knew that we were up here, and that we hadn't told the children, so they didn't say anything to the children, all my friends. And so I can't speak for all the people, but the people that we knew didn't seem to mind at all. Because they knew that my husband was making a good living and everything, and they didn't want to do anything to upset the apple cart. I never figured them to be exactly black. There's a lot of black people in Keene now. You recognize them.
Keene, as you know, to this date is a really white community. And it was the same then.
You never looked at their place, the Johnsons, because they didn't look that dark. I think if I remember, I can remember when the kids were growing up, their features looked, like Negroes, as we called them then. And I think a lot of people wondered.
The only black that I knew was a man that everybody respected. He was, his name was George Miller. He was the usher at the register, and everybody respected him greatly. And I don't know of another black family at that time living in Keene.
When I was a kid, we used to go down to
to the square and come in and look and see it, like if a black man was a chauffeur for a wealthy family in those days, we would go down to see him because we had never seen one before when I was a kid. Same thing when people were Oriental and came through, we would go down because it was strange to us.
Albert Johnston Jr. was the oldest of the Johnston children. He grew up assuming that, like the rest of his friends and neighbors, he was white.
I had never known my identity. That gave me a certain advantage and probably maybe a certain disadvantage. In other words, let's put it this way, psychologically, when I was a little boy and I went to the Aunt Larry School in Gorham, New Hampshire, and if I raised my hand, the teacher says, what would you like to be? I could say President of the United States, knowing that the door was open for me, because I did not know if I was part black, or part Indian, or part Jewish, or even Catholic in those days, before John F. Kennedy's time. If one would not conceive psychologically of ever possibly being President of the United States if he knew his minority identity in those times. That was the thinking of the country then.
America was confronting change in the early 1940s. World War II had started and the armed services were desperate for doctors. Like most, Dr. Johnston wanted to do his part in the war effort. He applied for and received a commission in the Navy Medical Corps. But the terrible truth of racism that the Johnston family had escaped for so many years finally caught up with him.
I have the papers to show where he was accepted in the Navy, and they assigned him to the ship that he was going to be on and everything. And then when the gentleman from Washington came to interview him, and asked him if he had brought, if he was black. Well, no, he didn't say it that way. Asked him if he had colored, this is what he said, do you have colored blood in your veins? And my husband says, well, who knows who's got what kind of blood in their veins? And so he said, well, that's all he wanted to know, and so he went out. He was very courteous and very nice. And then the next couple of days, because a lot of that he was rejected. And they said because he didn't meet the requirements of height and weight.
I think what happened was the Navy put its stamp of disapproval at Dr. Johnston by saying, you're not acceptable in our Navy. I think then it became socially acceptable to reject this. That's what I think. I think it's a trickle-down theory, of course. It's a racially segregated Navy, and when they said to Dr. Johnston, we're rescinding your commission, then it became acceptable to have something come out in the open and became a product.
Maybe a little bit about how the film came to be made. Very brief, though. I'm going to pass the microphone down. But de Rochemont, who was living on the seacoast, got the story in 1947 from young Albert Johnson, who by that time he had two, what they used to call nervous breakdowns over discovering his heritage. Ended up at the University of New Hampshire, had a friend who knew Louis de Rochemont. They went to visit him. He heard a good story. When he happened to ask, how come you want films about black people, you're not yourself? And he told him his history. So by 1949, the film came out. And as you can see from the advertisement, it's promoted as a domestic melodrama, as Hollywood did very well. Domestic melodrama is what you do to get people to come into an audience. You get them to identify with the characters. So you'll notice that young Albert is holding his hands up, and it says, for 20 tormenting years they lived a lie. So it was put totally in emotional, melodramatic terms. Race is not mentioned in the poster. My theory is if that had been, I don't think people would have gone to see it. But once they're in there and they see people like themselves suffering because of something they can't possibly control, and also the lead actors at that time, as was done, are all white actors, the lead actors. The actors in all the other subsidiary roles, and they become very important in the film, are all done by some quite famous African-American actors. De Rochemont was a progressive and very proud of it, and knew that he he was itching for a fight, and it got blocked. And Memphis, in Atlanta, they tried to ban it all over, and he just got his lawyers out and made sure that the film got shown, because this was the first film to treat African Americans, first Hollywood film, to treat African Americans as autonomous human beings with dreams, desires, and aspirations of their own, separate from some white superclass that was using them as servants or whatever. This film changed all that from their point of view. So that's its significance and some of the background.
I'm not really sure where to dive in. I had never seen the movie. I've never seen this documentary. And I only read like a couple paragraphs after being invited on the panel just to know like briefly what it was going to be about. So I have a lot of thoughts going on in my head right now. Like it's happening live right in front of you. I'm like trying to process it and figure it out. It'll be memorialized on these videos. The idea of passing, I mean, it's newer for me because it's something I only recently started learning about or hearing like directed at me. When I moved here from Connecticut, we were living in New Britain, it was like outside of Hartford, and I had maybe just, a few white kids in my class, so I didn't know the reality of what Vermont would be like. I was like 10 years old, so I didn't know racism, really. I mean, it was Black and Hispanic people predominantly around me. So when we moved here, I heard similar things to what they had said of like, well, we had never seen one before. And so I became like this spectacle for people to see. And, would try to make friends in school and then get invited to their house and then not be able to go. And some kids, quote unquote, knew better than to tell me why. And other kids just flat out let it out. Well, my parents don't like Black people. And it was this weird thing that I had never even identified myself as because I didn't need to. But even being light-skinned, like when I moved here, I may as well have had the same complexion as Wesley Snipes to them. Like they just had no frame of reference. I can't tell you how many times I heard I'd never met a Black person. I've never met anybody that wasn't white. Everyone looks like us. You don't. So right from the beginning, like my own understanding or relationship with my own racial identity was traumatic for me, because that was the introduction for me, was being othered at a very formative time in your life anyway, 10, 11, 12, and that's arguably like the identity stage anyway. So I had no idea what to think about who I was, where I'd come from. My mom is white, and the only dad that I've known is the father of my 4 younger sisters, and he's Hispanic, and he's just slightly darker than me, so he looks like he could be my biological dad, so everybody just thought he was. So it was almost like, or I won't say it was almost like, it was essentially suggested or implied or encouraged that I just be Puerto Rican, that would be at least a little bit better. And disturbingly enough, and I'm sure unsurprisingly enough to some people in the room, it was better. And it was just so strange to me that but I'm the exact same kid, but then if I'm Puerto Rican, because my dad's sitting here and we just coincidentally also kind of look similar, suddenly I'm allowed to go to that birthday party. And then it's this novelty in a positive way rather than a spectacle. So I don't know, that's all I have for right now. I'm still yeah.
I think we all are still processing. I'm grateful for my family. My parents are both from the South. My dad from North Carolina, my mother from Richmond, Virginia. And growing up, family members and my family came in all shades and sizes, right? And so I did not grow up with necessarily the stigma around my skin color, right? That was not something that was ever really discussed, except that you are brilliant, you are great, we are expecting a lot from you, go to school. Education is important. Those were the messages that I received from my family. And we expect you to do well. So that's how my older sister and I moved through the world. And so then we moved to, we were both born in New York City. So I grew up in New York, and New York is probably one of the most diverse places, as you mentioned, growing up in Long Island on the planet. And what's interesting, though, is growing up in New York, I think as I got older and I moved into education later on in life, what I realized is that you have, it's sort of like New York can be like a gallery, like walking through an art gallery. So you see on the surface, you see all the different people together, but rarely do you see people really interacting and really getting to know each other. And so you quickly learn, like you did, you learn which spaces people would approve your presence, right? And that was something that I learned how to navigate. But now, as an educator of young children, elementary school educator, and I was a rarity, right, as a black male in elementary education, as a male in education. And growing up, I remember my dad saying to me, we were watching a documentary one time, and I don't know where it was. It was a documentary, it was happening somewhere in Alaska somewhere, right? And so I'm sitting there as a young child and asked this question. And there was this black man on screen, and I said, Daddy, look, he's black. And I remember, this is very powerful, my dad turned to me and said, yes, of course he is. Black people are everywhere, right? And so I latched onto that. And so as I moved through my life, I let people's surprise and wonder be theirs, not mine, right? Because I hold on to my dad's telling me, black people are everywhere. In other words, you can occupy space anywhere you need to. So now here as an educator here at Keene State and working with a population of predominantly young white females, right? Many of whom have never had a black anything as an educator in their lives, and they have to deal with me. And I love my students, and I think that the students love me here because I tell them the truth, right? One class I was teaching in the beginning of the semester when I first arrived here, and I had a young white female in my class, and we were talking about issues of diversity, and she was talking about her best friend. And she was talking and sharing, oh, my best friend, and then she went and she whispered, and she's black. And my response was, in a full voice, she's black, do you think I'm sure she knows she's black. Why are you whispering, right? You don't need to whisper, right? And so to have those kind of challenging conversations where you push back. I use humor as much as I can. Sometimes I want to cry, but I do use humor as much as possible. And it's those subtle things. Why are you whispering about someone's blackness? Your best friend is black, claim it, right? And so I will challenge my students in a loving way, and I will challenge my colleagues also in as loving a way as possible. Dottie knows. But I think, when I think about the last thing I'll say for right now, for me, the story is about family, right? And the story is about your identity and how your family shapes that and your community shapes that. So when she shares in the film just now that we just saw that there were people that knew them that were protecting their secret, right? How does that feel? To know that loss of connection there, you know what I mean? I wanted to know for those families and those people who were put in a position where they felt like they needed to pass, what were they leaving behind? Right? I can't imagine leaving my family behind. I can't imagine leaving my New York City roots behind. It comes with me everywhere I go, right? My dad is always in my head. What are we people leaving behind? That's the question I grapple with.
I'd just like to say briefly that that issue does come up in the Johnston family when, after young Albert was told that he had a black heritage and he had a nervous breakdown and all of that, the first thing he did was start hitchhiking around the United States to neighborhoods in large cities where there was a black population that were his relatives, to getting to know his relatives. And he landed in, then he came back, went to the University of New Hampshire, got a degree in musicology, then married an African-American woman in California, later divorced, and his children still live out there. But his way of dealing with it was to travel around. And that's kind of encapsulated in the film a little bit when he goes to Harlem. It's a little not done all that well, but yeah, but you get the point. Because, yeah, but his experience was I've got to find out what this other part of me is, because like, it's going to become important.
Well, one of the things I want to point out, and then we'll start a conversation, is the whole idea of trauma, race-based trauma. Because Wayne talked about the traumatic event, you talked about the nervous breakdown, and but Darryl, you talked about kind of the inoculation you received by having your father tell you those types of things. So for it to be a social construct, you could see how, I'm gonna use a word and people get offended by it, but crazy making racism really is. This whole context of racism. And so what young Albert does is something that a psychologist by the name of Lillian Comas-Diaz talks about in helping people overcome race-based trauma. One is for them to get re-educated, reconnected with who they are, and to learn those. And one thing that Lillian talks about, and I'm almost sure she talks about, is as a Puerto Rican woman, she had to connect with her African roots because there had been such a disconnect of African roots in Puerto Rico. And so when you think about the diaspora, and like your father said, the Africans of African descent everywhere, including Matthew Henson, who was, anyway, but we don't need to go into that. But this whole idea of the nature of the diaspora and how the shame of blackness and how it has been constructed in such a negative way. And a lot of people say it's to counteract something a lot more powerful, but that's another story for another day about the power of blackness. So, and how we all are from that black roots. So any other things you would want to add to this around kind of the self-loathing that comes from a social construct that people have to actually disconnect themselves from a part of themselves, and yet that's the best way for them to recover is to reconnect with themselves?
I think, to respond to your question, I think, the trauma is life-shattering. It can be, right? And so you're doing this sort of this public performance piece, and then what is life like at home? What are you grappling with, and how are you making sense of that? And so it's challenging to move through life always being concerned about how you're being perceived. Right? And I don't think a lot of people who are not in that position understand that. And so when I encounter people who have stereotypical notions about who I am, I'm patient as possible, but I don't hold back. I don't get really defensive, but I try to engage in a conversation that holds up a mirror to them, right? And not me. It's not me that has the issue. If you haven't experienced something and you've occupied a certain space and you are defining the world around you, and then someone new comes in to that space, I think the challenge is to say to yourself, I should not automatically assume that this new thing needs to adapt to my world, right? We have to adapt to each other's world. Unfortunately, when you're a person of color here, you're often put in that position by people, that people are always trying to make you fit in. Like even in certain instances as a black male, I've experienced conversations where people are very passionate and very loud. But if I'm passionate and loud, how that's read, right? And I wonder how many people have to think about that. I'm a very passionate person. I'm a teacher. I'm an educator, right? I get very passionate because I want to stimulate people, build that excitement and model how do you learn? How do you do this? How do you explore? And so that passion is there. And I will name it now, and I will also name that I do not apologize for it in any way, shape, or form, right? I think owning certain things, I get that from my mother's cousin, and I love this one. And I'm gonna tell you the story about it because it's about passing too, or not passing, right? My mother's cousin, my cousin Ruby, photo album. I remember having a family photo album, and there was a section of black and white photos of my parents' lives before my sister and I came along, right? And so I was always fascinated by these 5x7 black and white photos. So I'm looking through the photo album, and I see this one woman, two women. One of them, both of them in those beautiful fitted suits, two-piece suits that women used to wear, the skirts and the gloves and everything. They were done, done up. I don't know if they were coming from church or going out, but and here they were in the daylight, and I'm looking at this image, and I said, I recognize my mother immediately. And I don't recognize that white woman. Who's that white woman? And I said, Ma, who's this white woman? And she said, that's Cousin Ruby. Now, you have to understand, my 6 and 7-year-old self had experienced my cousin Ruby. My cousin Ruby, by that point in her life, looked like Angela Davis. She was, sporting big, beautiful afro, dashikis, and everything. I had such cognitive dissonance. Who is this? Who is this, right? But now when I think about she was more like an aunt, right? Because she's my mother's cousin, but she was older than my mother. And when I think about Cousin Ruby, she was the first person that talked about playing tennis in my family. She was the first person that talked about, I didn't know what a country club was, but she would, talk about these parties that she would go to, and she would talk to me about the opera. Right? And so as a black boy growing up in the Bronx, not too many people were talking about the opera in the country club, right? So Cousin Ruby was this amazing wonder, but when I think about Cousin Ruby, I think about how she moved through life and how she may have gained access because of her very, very fair skin, right? And then what did she do in her mind to make a conscious choice to fully embrace her blackness, fully embrace black culture, right? I remember growing up and all the parties happened at Cousin Ruby's house. All the good food was there, all the great music. And Cousin Ruby always asked us to teach her to do the latest dance. And she could do it, right? It was wonderful. So having these models of resiliency is very important. I don't think we talk about race enough. I think in the context that we are in now, the politically charged climate that we are in, I think we need to talk about race more and more, and we have to lean into the discomfort of it. We have to understand that people are coming at it from different perspectives, and be hopeful, and just continue to push and listen. People don't listen. People talk a lot, but they rarely listen.
So that leads us into a good part. Let's have a conversation. Any reactions, any thoughts, any feelings?
I think it's an interesting story about Dr. Johnston and passing at the time that it occurred, because the movie came out in the late 40s, but I mean, you got to take this back a few years. And, you know, did he do a disservice to his children? Yes. Did he do something which at that time may have been just totally driven by socioeconomics? I mean, this man had just been through 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school at Rush, and now, in order to go on, really having the medical degree is nothing if you don't go on and do your training. And if you can't get training, what does that mean? You know, does it mean that he sits out and does nothing medically for an entire year so that he can apply again to a black hospital, of which there were only but so many at that point in the United States? Or does he do something that, hard to know, did he really, really want to do that or not? Clearly, as he started, by the documentary, he claimed his blackness to many of these white hospitals. So he clearly was trying to go down that road. So then at this point you say, what are you going to do? And I don't know what any one of us would have done at that situation, whether we would have tried to pass or not. And then the question is, okay, what do you do when you finish your training? And he clearly had made a decision that it worked, they could pass, and they did. I mean, I have people in my own family who have passed, so as we go back in history. So I think there's many of us who will stand here and say, I would never pass, I would embrace my blackness and all that that culture brings, and yet when faced with the situation that he had, I'm not sure what any one of us would do at that exact point.
I'm imagining that it was not a malicious intent on his part. In fact, he was probably doing this motivated to take care of his children and give them more access to things, right? And I'm thinking about my own family again, and we were recently, a few years ago, some cousins of mine, we all got together, and we were having a conversation with some of the elders in the family, and we started asking them questions about them growing up in the South, and realized that they did not tell us many, if not any, of the hardships that they actually encountered and experienced, and people around them were experiencing. And we were a little upset by that, because in a way, by them editing those stories of their pain growing up, we felt it did not prepare us to deal and cope with some of the realities that entered our lives, right? They were prepared at that generation. They were suddenly in a position to provide us with access that they never had. So I don't think it was a thought in their mind to go, oh, wait a minute, we've got to go back and fill you in just in case things get a little rocky for you. Let me tell you a little bit about our story. That never happened, right? But I think, you know what? It was the best of intentions, and it was about access, and it was about all the reasons that you clearly laid out. Why would you do that? Why not take advantage of that situation?
Well, he was afraid, I think, that the children would say something in school and compromise their position and be forced to leave. Yes, it was a real issue for the young. Yes, this book by Allison Hobbs. Allison Hobbs, she's an associate professor at Stanford University. She came to Keene to do much of her research. She's got 40 pages in this book. It's A Chosen Exile, A History of Racial Passing in American Life. There's an entire chapter, beautifully researched. And the reason I mention this is that in that chapter, she talks about a kind of a dissociated analysis of the way people in Keene responded to this discovery. One was the lived experience of the Johnstons was, well, they were treated pretty well by their friends, largely the working class people. It was the upper class people and Dr. Chase and I have talked about this before, and we probably will again. I hope you have something to contribute to this, but it seems to be, and if you watch the entire documentary, it was the people from the more, shall we say, the ruling class of Keene, if I may use that term, that went after them. But there wasn't a big problem until the movie came out. The movie changed everything. Between 1942 and 1947, the community of Keene dealt with the fact that they had an African-American physician and family. And it remained, in a sense, self-contained. Then the article came out in the Reader's Digest, December 1947. 1948, the book came out. 1949, the movie, July of 1949. And it was a sensation all around the country. And the movie, in the minds probably of many in Keene, presented these people as heroes. And to many people, they weren't. And suddenly Keene had to deal with there were people in Keene that had to deal with the fact that in some ways they were being looked at as racist or backward or something like that. And so the book deals with that in a way. The public record if you look at Ebony Magazine and Life and Look and other magazines, said that Keene was a very liberal community when it came to race. This would be a good place to come to move to if you wanted to live in a community where integration would take. But that wasn't the lived experiences of the Johnsons. By 1966, they had left. They wanted to leave. 1953, he lost his hospital privileges. And there was really no warrant for that from what I was able to find by looking at the hospital records of the board of directors. By May of 1963, they were claiming that he had set up a clinic at his house, which is true. He was doing X-ray work there, cheating the hospital out of money, and therefore he didn't deserve hospital privileges anymore. So from 1953 to 1966, he ran an office out of his house on Washington Street. So there's really a breakdown. What was the term you used? Dissonance between the way Keene was presented in the media and the way they had lived their experience.
So going back to just passing and family history, my parents are in their late 80s at this point in life, living still in Worcester, Mass, where is my long-term history since the 1800s in Boston and the 1700s. But I'm always pleased to be around them because they continue to share these stories. So we were talking about my nieces and nephews who have, I'd say, more racial fluidity than I do at approaching 60. So they're intermarrying, and it's sort of like less of a big deal. But our family has been so racially mixed forever that for our family, it's like, oh, so what? Next person in. So my mother and I start talking about my grandmother, who is very, very fair, sort of straight hair, and my mom is about my tone, and her dad was sort of very dark, and how they would hide in the car while my grandmother went into the store to buy stuff. This is in Oklahoma, where my mother grew up. So she starts telling me these passing stories that I'd never really heard her talk about before, all under the new conversation about racial fluidity. So your point about you wish they would tell you the stories, I'm starting to ask them more about it. And it comes up now more like, okay, I confront all these things in my life as a black professional in the area of the country where I grew up. People still ask me where I'm from, and I say, well, like here for a long, long time. We're in that kind of conversation, I reach out to them more and I say, hey, so is this better or worse? Like, what do you think? And then I get my coattails pulled with a story like that, like, well, yes, the struggle that you go through is important, necessary, keep up the fight, and it's better than it was, despite how awful it feels at times now. I think you can't be an African-American person living in a family in the U.S. that is not mixed already, and that doesn't have a part of your family that passed at some point around something. So yeah, that would be it.
Hi, thanks a lot to all four of you. So I grew up in West Virginia, Southern West Virginia, and I'm turned 65 this year. So that the timing, I think, is significant. So I grew up, and I can remember growing up in Bluefield and the subject of passing. You know, there always were people who were passing. And I can remember my parents saying, well, so-and-so is passing. So at a very early age, probably around the time that you learned about your aunt, your cousin, I learned about passing, and it was no big deal. It was no big deal. And I remember having a very light-skinned girl in my class who I had a crush on, and she used to run down the other steps as I tried to catch her to kiss her as she came out this door. Just foiled at 6. And I asked my parents if she was light enough to pass. And they said, no, I don't really think so. I don't really think so. But her father might be. And so, you know, just one of the things you have. You got it or you don't. And it was this type of, so I grew up in a privileged environment because white folks were at a distance. You know, I only went to school with black folks. They were really, the role models were all black. So I didn't grow up with some of the debilitating realities of living in an environment that is more racially mixed until I went away and I came to New Hampshire to go to school at age 15. And I went to Exeter, and it was the first time I'd ever had anyone who wanted to touch my hair. And I just really, you know, I was so shocked. I just really didn't understand that. But it was a time of black assertiveness. And as I went on and through college, if you were a light-skinned black person, you found the darkest-skinned black person that you could find just to kind of tilt the balance back in the way that was politically better, politically preferable. So it's these color things and making that decision and having the safety of coming back home every now and then just to kind of relax and be who you are. Yeah, they were very definitely protected, but the society was probably pretty segregated also, so that where they went, they didn't probably have a lot of social contact with white folks. And you know, this is why it's so important to tell these stories, because the impulse to squelch that knowledge, you know, it's like, why invite this ugliness into your life now? So you don't want to talk about that negative stuff. You know, it's impolite, you know, and why burden your life? You got enough to struggle with. We don't have to tell you this. We got through that. So that's all that really matters. I really get that. But the fact remains that growing up black in this state makes you feel double-minded, makes you feel a bad way about that. You got to fight against that. You got to claim your right to be black. You got to say, okay, my family's not white with 2 parents and 2 kids and 0.2 animals or whatever is supposed to be the norm. But I'm environment. I am this chocolate drop in this midst of mashed potatoes. You know, what am I going to do? You know, so you know, you have to say it is good to be a chocolate drop. You know, you've got to assert your chocolate dropness, and that's. And if you did not feel from the day you were born and aware of yourself, my daughter at 3 came home and said, I'm the only brown child in class. All the others are pink. If you from that moment understood that in this state and around you, there are the remnants of people who look like you that have been here from the very beginning, it makes you feel better and more at home and more like you belong and gives you less to fight over.
You know, we have to keep in mind about trauma and why some of the stories about passing may not have been told. Because trauma is a very interesting thing. Until you're ready to deal with it, you can't talk about it. It's too painful to talk about because it brings back all of the horrible memories. So I really think that a lot of people don't talk about those. 1, because there might be some shame now that they did pass. And 2, it's just too painful to go back there. It's not after people process it and able to really come to terms with it that they're able to talk about it. So, you know, like when my sister is significantly older, when she doesn't tell me about stories about what she went through when she went to college, being called a nigger every single day. She walked the nigger gauntlet. She never told me that. I never knew about that until one night I was having dinner with her and some of her friends and they brought it up and I was in shock. And part of what she told me, she said, it's too painful to even remember those times. That's why I never told you. And she said something you said, I didn't want you to have that memory etched in your head. It was horrible enough that I have it etched in mine. I didn't want to speak it. So I think that, again, would some of us have passed given the circumstances? I would probably say, probably yes. Because what happens, everybody enters into this crazy agreement that I'm not going to say you black if you don't remind me that you're black, and we'll be all right. No, they don't say all right. They'll say we'll be all right. We'll be all right. As long as you don't remind me, I'm not going to remind you, and as long as you just act like us, we'll be okay. But the minute you start talking about being black, that's when we'll have a problem with you. And so I think that that kind of passing, maybe even not like skin passing, but sometimes, even if you're as dark as me, sometimes you enter into the agreement to pass by not reminding people you're black.
When I went to UMass Amherst, I was put into the collegiate education of black students. Yes, I was. And I was totally shocked. It was in '74. And I'd gone from community college down there. And I said, what am I doing here? I don't belong here. They said, you're a minority, you're a woman. And that's how it was in '74, that I ended up with the collegiate education. And my diploma has collegiate education of black students on it. Yes, for real. And the other thing, my kid brother in the '70s married a widow, and she has 6 children. Her husband and the oldest son had died in a car accident. But before he had passed, he would pick her up at work. She was white, he was black. She made him wait around the corner and wouldn't let him be seen. She'd walk from work down around the corner and go get in the truck and leave and go home with him. And we always felt bad for the kids. And one of them died with drugs, one got killed in prison. And the kids just had a really bad, I think that was part of it, that the mom was depriving them of the socialization part of the dad. Just really weird.
I think sometimes there are just single experiences that ought to completely alter our thinking. And if I have a relationship with a black person who is passing, and I assume the default setting here of white, and for years and years we get along wonderfully, I admire this person's work, we're good friends, or it's an email connection or correspondence, and then I suddenly find out the person is black, that one discovery should just end all of my stupid, baseless, racist assumptions for all time. And I don't understand why it doesn't.
I read Resmaa Menacem's My Grandmother's Hands, which I feel like addresses so beautifully the issues around trauma and how we all get so dysregulated even saying the word black. When you mentioned the person was like, whispering. And I had that too, someone's, talking about someone else altogether and said, well, this black girl, then turned to me and said, no offense. And I'm like, what? Never mind. And, but also the trauma of not wanting to bring up or feeling alone in certain experiences. And this was in a few years ago, when probably in 2014 when I started seeing more and more videos of unarmed black people being shot and would watch them. I have a young son and who looks Puerto Rican. My husband is white. And just, driving to pick him up at preschool with tears running down my face, not even consciously remembering the last video that I had seen, but understanding that I was grieving about it. And another parent came up to the car, because I was like waiting to stop crying. And she said, what's going on? Let's take the kids to the park. So she hadn't heard at all about the last shooting. And so I was trying to explain to her, which is also painful and a reminder of being sort of alone in this experience. My son was playing, and I realized that he's, off with another young kid, and 2 other children who were a little bit older, one who was dressed as a police officer, and his friend who had a stuffed German Shepherd under his arm. And he had handcuffs and a gun. And I see my son running across the playground being chased by this boy dressed as a police officer, shooting him. And I literally thought that I had imagined it. Because it's what has been, my worst nightmare that had been running through my head. And the shame, too, that my first reaction was to censor myself because I didn't want to be the angry Black woman. And the other thing was thinking, I'm glad that my son doesn't look more like me. And so it's traumatizing. And so yes, so having these conversations is important, and it's also can be tokenizing. Well, I've been having a lot of these conversations in my community, and so being vulnerable and putting yourself out there and not really being seen at the same time is hard.
I think that a lot of my experiences relate more to what Dottie had referenced a few minutes ago about the social aspect of passing. That's definitely something I can relate to, and it comes up almost daily. When it's not being addressed by other people, it is like everything's fine until I call somebody out on something. Everything's okay until I'm aggressive. Everything's okay until I point out why that thing they said has a lot of context and they shouldn't say it. And please don't say that I'm being aggressive the one time that I actually hold you to the thing you said you're going to do. Because I'm very conditioned to just let people say what they want and to laugh along at their joke about something that must relate to me because I'm a Black person, but not really that Black. And that usually gets thrown in too. And it's like, I've said a lot lately actually that I think my autobiography will probably be called One of the Good Ones because I've heard that so many times. And something you had said about the perceptions, it's like, well, that should just shatter the perceptions. It's like on the flip side of that though, like I don't want to be that for people. And that continues to happen. It's like, oh, you really are not like that person that I thought, or you're not like that Black person on TV, you're not what I thought Black people were. And it's this weird balance of like this torch that you're supposed to carry that you didn't ask for, that somebody might be on your shoulder saying, you don't need to do that. But then how do you not do it? Because automatically you're carrying in all this history into the room with you, and people's perceptions are meeting you at the door before they meet you. And actually just recently, a friend of mine who works down in Concord was coming up to this meeting at Dartmouth. I was gonna go and I didn't go. And my boss went, and the friend walked in the room, and the person that was facilitating had never met me before, and she said, oh, welcome, Wayne. And he's also Black, and like pretty close to my complexion too. So when he told me that, I said, did my race precede me? Like, how did she assume out of anybody that he could have been that it was me, and I'd never met her? So that was really interesting, but it's not the first time that something like that has happened. The scenario that you were just sharing about your son and watching that happen, it is like this weird PTSD thing where I have to go through this mental Rolodex in my head to say, is this person acting this way to me because I'm a male and maybe they feel unsafe? No, is it because I'm Black? No, is it because of this? All these things instantly like cycle through of like, why are they being this way to me? A lot of the time when I have the energy to, I'll play little social experiments and watch like how they treated the person right before me. And then when I go up to the counter, there's my change. And then if I have the energy that day, I'll stand there and watch and wait for the next person to check out. And, oh, how are you doing? Good morning. Complete silence to me though. And to just float through the day and day to day with those experiences all day long, just building and building and building. And to feel like I'm crazy. Like Like in Vermont and New Hampshire, you're in a sea of whiteness, you're that chocolate drop in your community, and that's why all that stuff gets brought into the room with you, because you are the example. And so you're not allowed to be aggressive, you're not allowed to yell, or else you're fulfilling those stereotypes. And so just hearing how soft-spoken I'm being right now, that is from years of conditioning. Like when I'm in my own space, I'm very loud, I talk with my hands all the time, like when I get going, especially if I am worked up and I am being aggressive. But I was just on an interview a couple of weeks ago in a space predominantly of Black people, and a few of them that I had prior relationships with, and I was still talking like this during the interview, even though I know them. And one of them was on Zoom or Skype or whatever, and she kept saying, "I can't hear you, Wayne, can you talk up?" And I was, "Oh, yeah," and then I just drift back down. And they just kept stopping the thing and saying, "We still can't hear you." So I was glad when you said we're gonna do a mic check that there would actually be a microphone, because I knew that'd be a problem. I have to remind myself that I am allowed to have a volume to my voice. I have to remind myself that I'm allowed to be angry. I have to remind myself that I'm allowed to call people out for things. And it really is crazy making. I don't think there's any other way to put it. And thankfully there's research now coming out about that, about like the traumatic effects of racism and how it compares to other PTSD type situations. But it's not even post-traumatic because it doesn't stop. It's every single day. And so when somebody questions me or challenges me out of like, well, why can't you heal? And it's like, well, usually you have to have the recovery period. And it doesn't ever stop, because even if you get to the end of the day and you've only had 3 incidents happen, you know that it's all gonna start over again tomorrow. It's like Groundhog Day from hell.
And somebody by the name of Williams, I can't remember his first name, he talks about racial battle fatigue. And it's connected with all sorts of health, kind of the health impact of racial battle fatigue. He talks about the mental health, the physical health, the emotional health, and most of all, the spiritual health of people as a result of racial battle fatigue.
Just to add on to what comment you made and a comment that you just made, Dottie, just briefly, I'm thinking about racial battle fatigue and thinking about, as I work with my students, I tell them that it is not the responsibility of people of color to teach you about the world. There is so much literature that exists out there. If you can Google to find the location of the restaurant you want to go to, you can put in, right, Black consciousness, you can put in race, passing, you can put in anything in Google, and you will find that there is a literature, a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of scholars that are writing about this and doing this work, myself being one of them, then you can find it. And so I always push back, because it's been interesting in academia, right, to have to come in and have people come and they'll engage and start asking questions, and they'll ask questions of me, and I'm Dr. Hucks already. I'm not a student, and no, I don't need to, and so when you feel that energy of where people think that you need to meet their approval, that's usually where things go left, as the young people say, really quickly, because I usually will end the conversation or say something, or, oh, yeah, you'll find out more later, or, wish them well. We've got to move beyond this notion of the other has to prove themselves as being worthy. That is nonsense. That's just nonsense.
I was born in Bridgeton, New Jersey, South Jersey, etc., at Ghoultown. And if anyone has a copy of Ebony magazine, going back, way back with the 50s, 60s, it talks about the area where there was such this cross interracial marriage, et cetera, this and that type of a thing. So I have, when you talk a blended family, et cetera, I have blended families. Okay, we go from white to Black, my brother, right on back type of thing. And I also feel that I have a very rich history, because back in the 40s, someone wrote about the town. Now, I was able now to trace back to my great slavery, grandfather, Cuffy Cuff, whose son was Reuben Cuff, who basically started all the AME churches in southern Jersey, et cetera, walked to Philadelphia, this and that, et cetera, this and that. And so if I was to say where I stand, okay, with my skin color, I don't feel as pressured, okay, because I was raised with, okay, various skin colors, family-wise, and then our schools through high schools. I know my first racist thing was, I think, kindergarten. I don't remember it, but I remember my aunt telling me, I came home from kindergarten crying, and she said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "Someone called me a nigger," okay? And my aunt's very vocal. She goes, "Well, you are a nigger." So she, and
Let's have at least one of those on.
well, but
I aspire to be that one.
I must say though, that was a common word among, okay, Negro and nigger, okay. On my birth certificate, I'm colored, okay, et cetera, this and that. So I think I went to school with multiple, but I think we also lived in bubbles, okay. And through high school, I was very athletic, and my bubble was probably a lot of black, okay, et cetera. I was the rest of the team. The academic side, it was mostly white, et cetera, this and that. I didn't really start dating until like 11th grade, and it was copper tone girls. At that point, I thought I'd marry a copper tone girl, but I didn't.
I don't know what that means, but.
And so it's kind of like, I feel that I can sway both ways, and I'm very comfortable about that, especially knowing my history, et cetera, this and that. And I think throughout time, I see a lot of people who will say something, this and that, and in this situation, I may or may not correct them, okay? And during the 60s, I was out in California, doing I was an internship, this and that. And I went, and I had to go, because all my life I went to a black barbershop when I was home, okay? They cut my hair just like anyone else. When I was out in California, I went to a white barbershop, and back that time, the barber was nigger this, nigger that, et cetera, and I'm sitting there, and they had those razors that don't really see. So when I finished, I got up and I paid him, and I said, "You might want to sterilize your equipment because you just cut the hair of one of those niggers." Okay? And he didn't know what to do. And that's probably like in your face type pushing back. That probably didn't help. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So it's kind of like, I've been there, when I was growing up, my mother, when I was little, she'd always say, "Don't ever forget where you came from." Now, I think when I was younger, it was just, "Okay, Mommy, I won't forget you." Okay, but I think she was giving me a deeper, understanding. And as I was doing research of my history through this book and also DNA, I brought up stuff that she had told me as I was talking, and I didn't realize she was my complexion. And she when she was a teenager, she had to go up the balcony, my complexion, okay, to the movies. Now, when I went to the movies, that wasn't there. But then I also, back in the 90s, I interviewed a lot of elderly people on tape, and I interviewed one lady who was 90-something who delivered my mother, and she talked about how blacks couldn't go to the hospital. Now, we didn't really use blacks. We said coloreds couldn't go to the hospital, okay, et cetera, this and that. And so my mother and my sister, also was 4 years older than me, they were delivered home type of thing, et cetera. So I got her on tape, and she knew my great-great-grandmothers, and it was great, everything. So if I go through my life, and then my mother's friends when I was younger, she'd have friends who was like Japanese, married to a black soldier, and then another German lady. So it was never like difficult for me to accept. And when I went to college, what happened just recently, I just did my 50 years of graduation from RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology. And so one of the things that they had was they brought back the original students who started the Black Awareness group at RIT. And so they had a couple-hour session going on. And I was talking, and I knew a lot of there was only maybe 8 or 9 black students at RIT, okay, in the 60s type of thing. And so what happened was I was talking to one of them, and when he saw my name, he goes, "Oh, Lester Cuff." And I go, "Yeah," he saw my picture. He said, "We have a picture of you." And I go, "What? You got a picture of me?" Yeah, there's this big poster. So I had to go see it, okay? And it's like a couple of my close friends, black guys sitting, and I'm standing up behind them. Except now I wasn't part of the Black Awareness. I didn't start it, okay? But what the guy told me when he saw me, he goes, "Oh yeah, I remember you. You dated all those white girls back then." Okay? It was his comment, black guy to me saying I was passing. So and this was before the big discussion like this, so when we got into the panel discussion, they invited me. And so I just basically told him, I said, I dated girls of all colors type of thing. And my main motive was they had a secretarial group at RIT, and they were all white girls, and I couldn't type, and I had papers to do. So I dated white girls to get my papers done. Okay, so it's kind of like, it comes from both sides. Hey, you're passing, you're not passing, this and that. And I remember in high school I had, when I was doing football, I had a cousin. I didn't know he was my cousin at the time. He had the same last name, Archie Cuff, really good star. And I was 10th grade, he was 12th grade. And it would seem like when I go past him, he'd go real loud, "Hi, cuz." Like, "Hey, you're passing." So raise your hand, tell me which way am I passing here right now? Okay, so it's kind of like, I've been there, did that. We're also heavy now in the DNA. Okay, I can proudly say that 1/3 of my DNA is African American. I'm also, the other is white, but then I also a member of the Nanaco, Lenni, Lenape Indian tribe in South Jersey, et cetera. So I consider myself an American. And I can't, when we went up to this RIT thing, it was all the "I'm black and I'm proud, I'm black." I can't say that. What am I? I said, I'm an American. So it's like, I got thousands of stories of seeing both sides. And then my wife, she's the one who really gets, when someone says something out of line, she jumps up.
Well, I think that should be the role. You gotta say something.
Yes.
That's. I just wanted to maybe add it to his story. When this Ken recognized him, and he said, "Oh, you're the one passing and dating all the white girls," and after the little conference where they talked about this, and Les stood up and said that I was quite put off by that statement. He had said that I felt it was a racial statement, and it wasn't really racial, it was more of a biased statement. And when he came up to me, he says, "Oh, I hear that you're upset with me." And I said, "Well, yeah, I am, because he's caught in the middle ground, always trying to explain himself." And I said, for you, he wasn't black enough. For my parents, he wasn't white enough. And we had some black friends that accepted us because we were both light-skinned. They said if he had been dark-skinned, this black couple we were friends with said they couldn't accept us. So it was like, you know, it's a difficult situation to be in when you're in middle ground.
But see, I don't personally feel that difficult because I was raised all across, so it doesn't impact me as much. And I'll determine when to say what at the appropriate type of scenario, this and that. So, but like I say, I could go on forever, but you're.
I think that what we have to keep going back to is that racism is the core. That you're not black enough, you're not white enough, you're not whatever enough. But the thing about it is we have to look at the system that's creating it, not individual black folks who say you ain't black enough, because it's a byproduct of this larger system that we have evolving around us all the time that's creating that difference. And so sometimes it's real easy for us to point to individuals and say, you know, that, but it's about this system that has us all messed up about race. And that's the sad thing about racism.
That's a real, but has us all messed up.
It has us all messed
I'm
up.
62 years old and I'm like, I thought I had it together. You know, I didn't think I was a racist. And a colleague of ours, Allison, you know, she uses the phrase, a recovering racist.
Yes.
And it's, I mean, I'll be honest with you, it scares the shit out of me that I didn't think I was a racist. And dealing with that and facing it is really unsettling and humbling and eye-opening, you know, all these crazy words that I never thought I'd be talking about. And yet I'm really glad at least I'm doing it, right? So.
I really like that label or that identifier, recovering racist. Recovery is the work that I do, so I'm really comfortable with that. And it kind of, it helps lend it to the fact that it's messy, that it's an ongoing process. With recovery, I would never say that I'm recovered, right? Like I'm 7 years clean and sober, but I never say I'm recovered because it could just happen again tomorrow. And it happens in other ways, in non-substance related addictions. But I hear a lot of people say, like, well, I used to be racist. And so to be able to start throwing that out, like, well, no, you're recovering. You're working on it. I think that's...
Work your steps.
Yeah, just keep going. And once you get to 12, you go back to 1 and you start all over again. And if you relapse, please make amends and own up to it.
It's not a straight line, right?
Yeah, it's a perfect metaphor. I really like that.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing about the system. In '81, we had a son who was born in Dover, and at 24 hours, he arrested. And you fill out the paperwork when you have a baby, and you fill out who the mother is, what race the mother is, and what race the father is. And in '81, you had about 4 choices, so I said white and black. So our son was sent to Boston, and 5 weeks later, he passed away. So I sent for his death certificate. He was born mixed, he died white, and he was buried in his hometown, black. So the system decides who you are.
And that's the crazy making part.
It's very contextualized.
So, I was thinking about some of the stories, like what you were saying, Wayne, as well. Like, I went in the store the other day and I was thinking, it was a bunch of white girls in this little store downtown Portsmouth. Don't get a hello, don't get a thank you. Every other person that walks in and out gets a hello and thank you. But I grew up in a community where it's 2 to 4% black in both Durango, Colorado, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And I grew up with a white mom, a single white mom, and myself who was mixed, you know. So I always grew up feeling like obligated to have, to embrace my black side, but never really knowing how. So I would always join, you know, Black Student Union and things like that. But it wasn't until college when I experienced racism firsthand at myself that I wanted to start being, that I didn't feel obligated, that I wanted to be part of like a black community, that I wanted to have those, just that support there and stuff. And I don't know, I feel like it's different for everyone, passing or not passing, living with like a white family but wanting to have more blackness, not ever really experiencing it. So it's this weird in between for me.
Yeah, I definitely relate to that. I kind of said at the beginning that, you know, I'm still figuring this all out and wrapping my head around it, and that definitely be off the video. My own journey into like connecting to my blackness really just started a couple of years ago. So I was still living in White River at the time, which, by the way, the name was always around me. And we had a select board member who sent out I might have seen this in the news, select board member that sent out a racist meme of the Obama family as the Alcohol Hillbillies. And he, instead of sending it to his closed circle, mass sent it out to like using a select board email to everybody. So it got picked up in the Valley News, it became this huge thing, and so there was this select board meeting. Nobody ever goes to those, right? But like this one, like somebody called me, you have to come to this and that. I didn't know anything about it before they told me. And I get there and the line's out the door. And I didn't know what had even happened or what to expect. And I walk in and it was the first time, at that point I lived here for 20 years, just a couple years ago. The first time in 20 years that I was in a room with that many black people. And I was so overwhelmed, and I was just sitting there crying, and I was just so confused of how overwhelmed I was. And it was like, it woke up inside me. Like all the anger, all the pain, all the isolation, all of my only connection to blackness being this negative thing because it was just thrown on top of me. And like I said, having a single white mom and the only dad that I've known was gone. And so there was no black culture for me to latch onto. There was no black community for me to latch onto. I was the one in my community. And so it kind of like circled around me. And so I've gone through a lot of different phases, a lot of different versions of myself. What am I supposed to be or who am I supposed to be? And again, everything was okay as long as I just went along with it. So to be in that room and to be surrounded by that many black and brown people, it was definitely the spark that I needed. And that's shortly after that is when I founded the mentoring program and I started doing things like this and getting pulled in. And it happened like almost, I didn't ask, again, it was another thing that I didn't ask for. I went to that thing, I had no idea or plan to talk. People were going up to the podium and speaking, and I was just sitting there listening to this racist after racist after racist person go up to the podium and stand up for this man who, he really is a good man. He is a good person. And he just made a mistake, and I think that we just were blowing this out of proportion. We need to let it go. And before I knew it, I was standing up at the thing and saying it was literally to the month, 20 years before that I had moved there to that town, and what had changed. Now we have social media to plaster it all over, but I'm sure there were black and brown kids in their school. There's more people of color now in River than there was. I literally knew no one else. Now I can just drive down the street and see other people. So that changed. But do our experiences change? Has that changed? So now with all this push to diversify workspaces, diversify classrooms, the ethnic studies bill, all of that stuff, like I'm like, yes, yes, yes. And what's gonna happen? What's the backlash? I don't hear anybody preparing for the backlash of that. And to protect the kids that are going to be sitting in that classroom. Now, this white student's being forced to hear this language, and this teacher's being forced to share it out and teach it. And who's going to suffer at the other end of that? Who's going to be on the receiving end of the N-word over and over and over again? And it still brings me to tears now because I remember it, I know it, and it's just so raw. And I really hope that we can do the parallel work of putting the supports in place, and that's why I started the program. But it's definitely not enough, and there needs to be more. And also, real quick, I love that a couple of you had said, like, you came hoping to meet other black people. And so after that town meeting, they basically like pulled me into being on this committee that got formed, which was out of duress, really. The select board obviously doesn't want that committee existing because it exists because of this mistake that this guy made. Yeah. So I was on it for a few months and I walked away like, this is a joke. Like, it's just a sham. We're not really doing anything. We're explaining what each racist term is to the white people that are in the group with us. and it's exhausting, and it's painful, and it's draining. And so I kept going to every little workshop I would see pop up, because then all these things are popping up. And I'm right near Dartmouth College, so there's a lot of things that happen. But every time I would go, no offense, as I said, this is what the room looks like. And actually even less. Like, at least there's a couple of black and brown faces in the room today, but usually it would just be me. When I went looking for connection and community, and then I'm sitting watching white people learn. And it was fun a couple of times, and I was happy to see that the work was being done, people were trying, but then it was just traumatizing all over again, where I was like, even the conversations are not involving us. No, we should not have to do the work, but I also don't want to be the only one sitting in the room.
Dr. Johnson had 4 children, Dr. and Mrs. Johnson. The daughter, Donna, married white, and in Troy, New Hampshire, and their granddaughter, their daughter Jody, his granddaughter, was a friend of mine. She told me a story when she was going to elementary school in Troy, New Hampshire, and she did not look in any way stereotypically in any way like an American. That when they got to issues in the civics class of race, the teacher on one occasion said, now we have an example when you were in our class, Jody, will you stand up and let the students look at you? And she didn't get upset easily, but so that was her experience.
I just want to say something.
I was similarly having had conversations in my community about race and having a young son. I feel impatient. It's like wanting people to be curious and examine their own humanity, and not knowing how to do that without putting myself in there, helping people along and taking care of them.
And I think that's the challenge. In a way, I'm glad that that's a part of my job, because I can put my mind in a space as an educator and say, okay, this is an educational moment, right? This is not something that is about me feeling tired and possibly resentful of, again, being put in this position to have to educate another adult, right? Who has access to the same information that I do, right? I think that is the challenge, and we have to always think about that and balance that and talk it through. I do want to make a comment about the system. For me, people create systems, right? And people uphold systems. And it reaches a point of where the conversation can go where it's the fault of the system. We can't do that, right? We have got to push back against that notion of the system being out there. We're the system right now, in this room, right? We are upholding certain beliefs, certain values. Right? That's something that I hold on to because it really, I'm preparing in my mind and in my heart, I'm preparing educators that are going to be different, right? I'm preparing them to enter into schools in a different way. And I'm preparing them to be able to withstand the pushback from people who have upheld systems that have underserved students that look like the Dr. Hucks they have come to love, right? So we've got to talk about it. And it can't be, well, that's the system. It's the system.
One thing I want to raise, because I looked at the time and I think we're supposed to be done at around 4, and I want to respect your time. But I have one question to the group before we go. And this question is this. If we want to move beyond black and white, and we know it's a social construction, what language do we need to use in order to confront the system based on wanting to move beyond a system that continues to want to define us as either black or white? How do we do it? What language do we use? Do we have to create new language? Do we have to create another consciousness? So how do we push through this and change the things since we are the system?
Part of that goes back to what you said before. You said, well, I'm an American. And that's something that's been bothering me lately. We're no longer Spanish American, French American, a Finnish American. We've become made into this component that's where the language comes in, that we're Americans, yes, but we're supposed to forego our heritage. And it goes, I first met Barack Obama here when he was a senator. He was in the gym, and everybody had left. And I hollered to him, and the second time I hollered to him, he turned around because he was looking around the room and nobody's there. And I went over and spoke with him. Everybody says we had Barack Obama, first black president. No. He was a half black president, half Caucasian president. So that's part of it, the language. I have a degree in sociology, is to change the configuration. Yes, we are Americans. Yes, we should love America, but we should not forsake our heritage, and we have to bring that back into the conversation.
Dottie, let me just complicate your question a little bit in that I'm of a different race altogether, Asian. And so it's always been a difficult question for me in terms of where I fit in all the discussions that I've participated in or heard or listened to as somebody who is a Chinese background. But race is something that, it's a concept that I have grown up with and I have been aware of since as soon as my parents thought I could understand that I needed to know that I was of a different race. So for me, your question is a really complicated one. And I think that many of my friends will say to me, well, you know, we don't ever really think of you as Chinese or different from us. And, you know, there's the good and the bad to that, right? Mm-hmm. So I know what they're trying to say, but then sometimes I detect something underlying that that isn't being said. So I think that the concept of race is, in our country, I think, there are more Asians now living in the U.S., and our population is changing in that direction as well. And you know, I see Chinese walking the streets here in Keene, and they don't ever say anything to anybody. They keep their heads down, and they just go about their business. And I will say hello, and even at times, they will be afraid to say anything back. So I thought I'd just complicate your question.
No, I don't know the answer, and I wish that we could have more of those type of conversations around it, because then if you add on top of that immigration and immigration status, and if you add on top of it being the model minority, you know, what does that mean to be the model minority as Asian American? Because again, it's socially constructed. You know, who deemed that to be true? Well, it's all socially constructed. So we have to figure out a way to have that conversation. You had something to say.
Well, I did, but we're at a closing place, and I can have the last words because I'm president. So somebody else can speak if there's another person.
I had read this metaphor once that I think really speaks to us here in the United States. How many people here like salad?
Like what?
Salad.
Yeah. Salad.
Like tossed salad.
Yes.
So we were supposed to be the melting pot, right? We're supposed to be the melting pot. But we're not. But you know what makes a tossed salad so great is that you go, you know, I really like that red romaine, and I really like that those cucumbers from Lebanon, and I really like the cherry tomatoes or whatever. We are a tossed. And I kind of like being a tossed salad because I can embrace the fact that I am part of the salad. I am an American. I am part of the salad. but I bring my own selfness to it.
Thank you.
I think to speak about the comment that you made about your friends saying that you're a part of us and you not feeling that they are fully embracing all of who you are. Identity is an interesting thing, right? Identity is within the hands of those around you. People may hit one or two things, distinct parts of your identity, and it's rare that people really get all of it, the fullness of it. And so I don't think we have spaces that allow us to talk about those things. I think here in Keene right now, I've been in Keene, I came to Keene from New York City 10 years ago. And people talk about community here a lot, right? And I see a lot of work around community and people coming together and people supporting each other. But sometimes it doesn't get, in my eyes, it doesn't get beyond that point, right? Community remains on the surface, and it doesn't really get to the messier parts of who we are in the community. And I think until we can get the shovels out and start digging, or get those tongs out and start tossing that salad, right? And see the messiness of it, we will continue to fall back on those, systemic stereotypes, right? Systemic notions of who we are, and not create spaces where people can be self-defining, can walk in and say, the fullness of who you are can be in the room with everybody else's fullness, and it's okay. And it's going to look like a beautiful salad. I'm going to hold on to that metaphor.
So, one last comment.
My background is as a massage therapist, and so a lot of the unconditioned. My shoulders hurt. The things that I try to, help with conditioning are in the body. And, we experience trauma in the body. We experience belonging in the body, race as we walk around in the world, in our bodies. So having practices that really help us know ourselves and that can touch that conditioning. Really knowing ourselves, the work is in ourselves, and understanding our own personal conditioning to undo is one of those ways we can, the microcosm that can filter through the macro systems.
And on that note,
Thank you all so very much. Before we close, I'll just kind of summarize a little bit, and then I'll have our president close. And if we're lucky, he may even close us out with a song. But I just wanted for us to think about what happened today. This is part of this reconciliation, right? There's ways that we can, as individuals, we don't have a national language, we don't have a national movement going on about reconciliation and reparations. But this kind of dialogue is a part of that healing and a part of that, being willing and open to sharing your stories and listening to those stories. So I want to thank the people who were really allowing themselves to be vulnerable enough to share these stories in this space with a group of people they don't know. So I want to thank you all for doing that. One of the things I want you to think about as we leave here today is, what does it mean for a person to actually have to play into stereotypes to survive? We heard those words today, that I use humor a lot to get by, or I have patience, or all these other coping mechanisms. I have to forget who I am. So what does it mean to the individual that they have to play into stereotypes in order to survive? What does it mean that we're sometimes ashamed of who we are, of our blackness, of not speaking up, of not talking out, because we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to create these make other people uncomfortable with our truths? What does it mean that we are the system, that we are the ones creating it, and that we can undo it? And the other thing is, what does it mean that good people can be racist? We have a lot of those stories going on around. So those are just some of the questions I would want us to think about as we leave today. And I'll put in a plug for the Black Heritage Trail. We're doing this work. It is our mission, it is our goal to create spaces for these dialogues, to create visible spaces as well. There's so much that we don't know about New Hampshire's Black history that we can falsely say New Hampshire is one of the whitest state in the Union, totally erasing the 400-year history of Black people of color living in our state. So we're creating these visible spaces where we can actually see each other. Because I was really curious, you know, the Black people have always been here, but it took an incident for us to see that, oh my goodness, they are Black people here. And I'll just add, I didn't know I was Black till I came to this country. I'm from Jamaica, so I was Jamaican. And so I totally understand what you mean. There are all these levels that we create around color and colorism to try to understand. So, in closing, go on our website, look for what we do, visit us. We have an office, we have tours throughout the year. Sign up for our newsletter, and we look forward to seeing you whenever we're back in Keene.
And give money.
Thank you so much for everything.
Donate. Donate. Give money.
Thank you guys, and thanks to all of you. I echo Jerry Ann's appreciation that you were so vulnerable, so many of you were willing to be so vulnerable. I had just a few things. One is that I don't believe that there is a place in America where the mother, more so mothers and fathers, I think, of a Black child doesn't have anxiety. It's just a very scary situation to be in. And what makes it harder in New Hampshire is that you don't have the support group around you of other mothers who are sharing that fear. So it just might be helpful for you to know that. I want to thank Dottie for saying, I'm okay as long as I don't remind them that I'm Black. Because sometimes white folks will say, they think it's a compliment, I don't even notice that you're Black. And that gives me some, that's not a compliment. I think that what they're saying is that you don't make me feel uncomfortable the way that I expect you would if you made me think of you as being Black. Yeah. So, so I just wanted to just also thank you for giving me that insight that's what that's about. I remind them too much. I was in a community, I lived in a community for 32 years in a school, it's Phillips Exeter, and there were 2 Black people in my department, and a white colleague once said, I've never worked with Black people, but I find him a lot easier to deal with than you. So I was the troubling Black man, and he was the good Black man. It put us both in a bad situation. He's by nature a little more quiet, and I'm by nature not. So it's very difficult, and so it's not also easy. You know, I'm a big Black man with a big Black voice that's very hard to get softer. I can get softer if I need to, but usually it's not what I'm doing. And I also sing, and I happen to think I dance pretty well too. So I fulfill all those stereotypes. So the answer to my answer to your question, Dottie, is that we will not get to a good place until we are willing to see each other as we truly and authentically are, and support each other in that way. I gain nothing if you don't see that I'm Black. That means you don't see me. So see that I'm Black, just don't let it be an issue for you. You know, love it anyway. I have one song that I thought of, and I will sing, Jerry, and I'm very hoarse. I have no idea how this is going to go. So if I have to stop and try again, then I'll make sure that I don't do all the verses over. So I hope I don't mess up. And I'm thinking about this because I think that racism makes victims of all of us. And in a sense, we're all imprisoned. And so we're doing the work of the trail because we want to do our part to try to break free of that. And so I would say, you know, please donate to us. You know, look at the website and see how you can do that. Please help us to do this work, continue to do this work. When Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. Thus saith the Lord, old Moses said, let my people go. If not, I'll smite your firstborn dead. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. No more in bondage shall they toil. Let my people go. Let them come out with Egypt's spoil. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh